Yesterday, we had three major elections occur in Europe. We had two presidential elections, one in Romania and one in Poland, although they were different rounds of those elections, one in the first round, one being in the second round. And we also had a general election occur in Portugal. All these elections are going to be very important, and I want to cover each of them in this video, at least somewhat briefly. These are, of course, countries I don't focus on as much as Germany. I don't know as much about as Germany, so I won't go into depth as much as I do as some of the videos about the German elections or even the German state elections. I'm not as aware of all the regions and the different demographics, but I do want to give, of course, a general overview because these elections are important, not only for the countries themselves, but overall, the political balance of power in the European Union, because these are all EU member states. Now, the first election I want to look at is the Romanian presidential election. We had the second round of this election, which decided the winner, and there was a clear result. Nicolas Jordan, the centrist candidate who is the mayor of Bucharest, won the election with 53.6% of the vote, defeating the nationalist right-wing populist George Simeon, who came second with 46.4% of the vote. Now, George Simeon came first place in the first round with a wide margin, but it looks like a lot of the other parties that got knocked out, that came in third and fourth, kind of consolidated around Nicolas Jordan, and he was able to make up his margin in the second round, beating George Simeon. So this is, of course, a very important election. It was a very polarizing election after the 2024, or the initial election itself, which was held in 2024, was canceled, in which Călin Georgescu and Elena Lasconi were basically, the original candidates. The second round was canceled and the first round was annulled, and those candidates kind of went away. We had a new slate of candidates come in. We had a kind of complete rerun of this election that created a lot of controversy, a lot of division in both Romania and Europe, and we saw kind of a clear political divide line drawn across the entire continent, with some of the more pro-EU liberal leaders, such as Emmanuel Macron from France, supporting Nicolas Jordan, and then some of the more nationalist right-wing populist leaders, such as Giorgia Meloni or Viktor Orban, so more supporting Simeon openly. And of course, this is an election to determine the presidency of Romania, but this president will be influential in European politics as well as the head of state of a EU member state, and that's for that reason there was a lot of influence from outside sources, different countries supporting whoever they think is going to be best serve their interest and best be an ally within this block of countries that is in the European Union. So, clear result, we are finally at the end of this kind of saga of the Romanian presidential elections. It initially started in November. We had, some time before the election was even canceled. They actually waited for the beginning of the second round to cancel the second round of the elections when it happened in November. And for a while, we weren't sure if Călin Georgescu was going to be able to run. And then eventually, he was barred from running again. And that's why George Simeon ran in his place. So we had, we weren't sure who the candidates were going to be until, a few months ago. So there's been a very hectic political, campaign in Romania, and also it's brought, because of the kind of unprecedented nature of this election, it's brought a lot of attention from the international sphere, not only from the U.S. but also from Russia, from the United States, from other countries outside the EU. So this has been a very interesting campaign. But we have the final result. Nicolas Jordan will be the president of Romania for at least this electoral term. This is definitely a defeat for George Simeon. However, he was an outsider. He was someone who didn't have too much political experience. His party, the Alliance for the Unity of Romanians, I believe only is really kind of existed since 2019. They've only been active in the Romanian parliament for the past several years. So it was going to be an uphill battle for him to be able to win the second round. But he did have a large base of support. We see, even then, it was, he did get 46% of the vote. That is a large amount. And so we see Romania is somewhat divided in this situation. And I want to take a look at the map. Now, if we take a look at the map, we can see, there are some clear dividing lines. Now, Nicolas Jordan represents kind of the more liberal, progressive base in the country, probably appeals a lot more to minorities, students, pro-EU groups in the country. The places where Nicolas Jordan did the best was, of course, the city of Bucharest, the capital of Romania, where he's the current mayor. He did very well there, as expected. And a lot of the other urban centers in Romania he did very well in. And the second area he did very well was in the Carpathian region in Transylvania, where you have a large minority of Hungarians. And the party that represents this Hungarian minority actually endorsed Nicolas Jordan in the second round after they endorsed after Antonescu lost out in the first round. And so we see this part of kind of the northwest of the country, the Carpathians, and of course it's not only Hungarians here. There are still Romanians here, but we see a large Hungarian minority, and they obviously heavily back Nicolas Jordan. But then in the rest of the country, the rural parts in the east and in the south, we see that George Simeon won a majority of these areas and kind of the rural suburban areas in the rest of Romania. So we see somewhat a divided country, different demographics, different groups going for either Simeon or Nicolas Jordan, as we see in most elections. Now I want to take a look at the overall results to kind of get an idea of maybe where the votes came from. Now, Nicolas Jordan started off with around 21%, and George Simeon had 40%, which means Simeon had a base, twice as big as Nicolas Jordan's. However, what's very interesting to note is that the third place candidate arguably played a major role in this. So Nicolas Jordan was kind of considered a non-establishment centrist, whereas Crin Antonescu was backed by the Social Democrats and the National Liberal Party. So Nicolas Jordan is somewhat of a centrist, whereas Crin Antonescu was a person who was backed by the center-left and the center-right, which in a way makes him also a centrist. But Crin Antonescu was somewhat considered more of an establishment figure. He was backed by the traditional parties. However, I think in the end, a lot of his voters, the overwhelming majority, probably ended up going to vote for Nicolas Jordan. And when you add, maybe 15 of that 20%, that gets Nicolas Jordan very close to beating George Simeon. Victor Ponta, who was the former prime minister and from the Social Democratic Party, he did not endorse anyone. Of course, his party is his former party is backing Crin Antonescu. And so a lot of his voters probably went for Nicolas Jordan. However, he has given some favorability to George Simeon. And so I believe that some of his voters probably did split evenly. But I think with this result, it's clear that maybe some of them more than expected voted for Nicolas Jordan. But another important thing to note is that there were more people that voted in the second round that voted in the first round. And so we could have seen a lot of voters, upwards of several million, who went out and voted, not necessarily because they preferred Nicolas Jordan, but maybe to prevent George Simeon from winning. Or there's some people who maybe weren't interested in any of the candidates in the first round, but then they got more engaged after the debates, after the the campaign in the in the week in between the two rounds of the election. So it's not necessarily that all of these votes get translated into the second round. There are some people who did vote in the first round who probably stayed home and didn't vote because their candidate didn't make it into the first or second round. But there's also, probably a few million people who went out and voted even though they didn't vote in the first round, either to prevent, George Simeon from winning, or because they actually, or because Nicolas Jordan won them over and they decided actually to go out and vote because they were enthusiastic about that. But overall, that's going to be it for this election. So we now have Nicolas Jordan as the president of Romania. This, will impact Romanian politics definitely a lot. However, we will still have the national elections. We'll still have, a tight, a very difficult path towards forming coalition governments. Now that we have this strong nationalist camp, we have George Simeon's Alliance for the Unity of Romanians. You have two other parties, and so we could see the nationalist right in Romania grow even further and make traditional coalitions in the Romanian parliament somewhat more difficult. But of course, once we get, once we have more elections in Romania, we'll definitely cover that, but that's going to be it for Romania. The other big stories of the night was the first round of the Polish presidential election, and these elections are usually held in 2 rounds with 1 or 2 weeks in between for campaigning, and because of this, we had the second round of the Romanian presidential election occur on the same day as the first round of the Polish presidential election. This made things a bit hectic. It would have been optimal to cover them on separate days, but that's just the way it was. Now, with the results, Rafał Trzaskowski of the Civic Platform came first place with 31.36% of the vote. This is the liberal candidate from the liberal civic platform or liberal civic coalition, and the right-wing National Conservative Law and Justice Party's backed candidate Karol Nawrocki came second place with 29.5% of the vote. This is the way the presidential elections in Poland have been for the past several decades. In 2020, 2015, 2010, I believe even in 2005, the candidates of the Law and Justice Party and the Civic Platform or Civic Coalition have made it to the second round to a runoff to face each other. In the early days after the fall of communism, you had different political parties, you had independents that were able to make it into these elections. However, basically since the late 90s, early 2000s, Polish politics has polarized along this dividing line between the Civic Platform, which is a more liberal party, and then the National Conservative Law and Justice Party. And if you take a look at the map, you can see this clearly. Pretty much the entire country is colored either in, the dark blue or the yellow for these two parties. You had other candidates that were able to get, a significant amount of the vote, but no one that's able to really challenge one of these candidates for first or second place. Now, if we take a look at the overall results, we can see that Rafał Trzaskowski is the clear frontrunner in this election. He won with 31.36% of the vote, 2 points ahead of Karol Nawrocki. He is won this first round, and it is very likely that he will become the next president of Poland. He is expected to win the second round of this election. However, his margin in the first round was expected to be much bigger, and not because he did worse than expected, but rather that Karol Nawrocki did a lot better than expected. Trzaskowski was expected to get around 30-31% of the vote, and he did that. However, Nawrocki was polling at around 25-26% of the vote and ended up getting almost 30%. And so the margin of the first round was a lot closer than expected, and because of that, we could see the potential for the second round to be a lot closer and there to be a tight race between these two candidates. Now, the other important thing to note was the amount of votes that went to the two right-wing candidates. Now, you have Sławomir Mencen, which represents the Confederation Party. The Confederation Party in Poland is an alliance of different political parties, some more Catholic national conservative parties, some right-wing populist parties, some more libertarian political parties, even some monarchists in there. You have several different right-wing political parties, and this has become a kind of alliance that is considered to the right of the Law and Justice Party, a more anti-establishment, more non-traditional, unconventional. Right? They appeal to a lot more younger voters, people who are maybe tired of voting for the Law and Justice Party. And their official candidate, Sławomir Mencen, did very well, winning around 14.81% of the vote. He came in third place. There were some polls that had them winning second place, actually beating Karol Nawrocki a few months back, but he then lost his momentum, and Nawrocki was able to reassert himself as one of the main candidates. And so we do see that Mencen did not make it into the second round. However, he did have a very good showing, better than all the other candidates, and also somewhat over. This is, I believe, a record for the Confederation Party. This is better than they've done in either of either the general or the European elections that have happened recently over the past several years. Now, Gregor Brown actually came from Confederation. He actually came from the Confederation Party. However, he decided to run on his own, and because of that, him and his political party were suspended from Confederation. And so even though he's in a part of Confederation, he appealed to some of the same voters or similar voters. And what this means is Mencen and Brown form a block of around 21% of the vote, actually to the right of the Law and Justice Party, and this changes the dynamic of this election somewhat significantly. All three of these candidates, Nawrocki, Mencen, and Brown, somewhat overperformed expectations of what the polls were showing. And what's interesting is that these three candidates combined have over 50% of the vote in this election. Now, they are all right-wing candidates. They are all similar on a lot of issues, but it's not, of course, guaranteed that they will all vote for each other. So what's very interesting is I think that this election shows that with this strong showing from Mencen and Brown, I believe that Nawrocki has the potential to win over these voters, but he's not guaranteed to win over these voters at all. A lot of these people are right-wing, like Law and Justice, but they maybe view the Law and Justice Party as out of touch and corrupt, that it's not really being able to get things done. And so I think that Rafał Trzaskowski has a higher floor. I think Nawrocki has a higher ceiling. What that basically means is Trzaskowski is starting ahead of Nawrocki. He's going to basically guaranteed get a lot of the voters from candidates that are running from parties that are inside his coalition. Simeon Hołownia, which is the Speaker of the Polish Parliament, he comes from a political party that is actually in coalition with the Civic Platform. So this 5%, also the left-wing party candidate from Magdalena Bieniat, these votes will almost guaranteed go to Trzaskowski. So we can see that Trzaskowski has a kind of floor of around 40% of the vote. He's starting at around 40% of the vote ahead of Karol Nawrocki. However, I think Nawrocki has a chance to win over a large amount of this 20%. Now, if he doesn't, he will lose the election. But if he's able to, I think there's enough votes here for him to actually win this election. But of course, that's not guaranteed. He has to do a lot of work to convince these voters. But I think that since there is, 21% going to Mencen and Brown, if he starts making appeals to go, start shifting his program to the right, this actually shows that there's enough voters for him to actually, manage to do that. Whereas if Mencen had only got 12% and Brown had only got 2%, then maybe shifting to the right would hurt him because the losses in centrist voters would negate, or the loss in kind of center-right voters would negate his gains in more right-wing, far-right voters. But with this amount of the vote, I think that it's fair to say that Nawrocki has the potential to win over these voters and win the election. But of course, he's by no means the favorite. Trzaskowski is ahead, and I think that Trzaskowski will pretty much almost certainly get most of the voters from Hołownia and Bieniat without doing much work. He will probably have to convince some of the voters from Adrian Sandberg, which is a left-wing candidate that is not part of the coalition. And so I think that the election will be very interesting. I think that the results for the parties that didn't make it to the second round show that this election will be somewhat closer than we initially anticipated. I predict that Trzaskowski will probably win this election with around 52% of the vote. I think that he is still the favorite. I think he's still the front runner. I think it is most likely that Trzaskowski will win this election. However, I think based on these results, it is fair to say that if Karol Nawrocki runs a good campaign, if he's able to appeal to these Confederation voters, I think he has a shot at becoming Poland's next president, which will be a third consecutive term of someone backed by the Law and Justice Party, which will be very important because this election matters a lot because of course, the new government, since the Law and Justice Party lost power, and you have a prime minister from the Civic Platform, Donald Tusk. There is deadlock in the country with a prime minister from Civic Platform, and then a president from Law and Justice. And if Law and Justice is able to hold their presidency, they will keep that deadlock, and they were able to prevent their enemies, their political rivals, Civic Platform, from bringing all the change that they wanted to do. And that could buy them time till the next parliamentary election for Law and Justice, and maybe even Law and Justice and Confederation to win a majority and retake power in Poland. Lastly, I want to look at the Portuguese legislative election, which was held also yesterday. This is somewhat of a repeat of the elections that were held in 2024, where the center-right Social Democratic Party won the election, won first place, but was well short of a majority. And because of that, you didn't have any really long-lasting coalition, and we had a vote of no confidence for Luis Montenegro, the prime minister, and then we had a new election, which was held yesterday. And the elections were definitely a shift to the right in the country. We saw the center-right under Luis Montenegro won first place again, but by a much wider margin. They went from around 28 or 29% of the vote to 33% of the vote. And then the socialists from the center left kind of lost a lot of support, falling from 28% of the vote down 4 points to 23.5% of the vote. So the margin between the center right and the center left has definitely grown in this election. But the center-right is still short of an overall majority. They'll have to look for either coalition partners or, a party to support them in being a minority government. But this is nonetheless a victory for the center-right. They did come first place, and they did increase off of their result from the last election by two different variables. They did win this election. They did win in this election. The center left did suffer a defeat here. This is a very bad result for them. They lost the elections, and they lost in the last election, and now they're even further behind. And what's also very interesting is the result for the right-wing populist Chega party, and they won third place, but almost actually took second place. They actually tied in the number of seats with the Socialist Party. Both won 58 seats in the Portuguese Parliament or Portuguese Assembly. Chega won 18% in the last election, and this time they won 22.6%. So a huge increase, and not huge, but a decent increase in the amount of vote they got. And this is actually a lot more than they got in the EU elections. Some of the other elections, they were not able to repeat their 18% of the vote. I believe they only got around 10-11% at the EU elections. However, here they've not only been able to replicate what they got in 2024, but grow on that, winning 22.5% of the vote, rivaling even the center-left Socialist Party. And in a lot of states, they actually came second or even first place. I believe they did very well in the south of the country, even beating the center-right Social Democrats in some areas, and of course also the center-left Socialists and others. Now, I'm not as familiar with Portuguese politics, but I do know some of the basics. And this election is also not going to provide a clear pathway to form a government. The left-wing parties, including the socialists, the communists, some of the Greens and left-wing populists, do not have a majority. And so you basically have two options here. The center-right, with some of the more liberal parties, also does not have a majority. And so the kind of two options going forward there's rather three options. There's a possibility of a grand coalition, like as we see in Germany, between the Social Democrats and the Socialists. This is somewhat unconventional. This is not necessarily something that both parties want to partake in, but if there's a threat of a new party like Chega, on the rise, it is possible that they could maybe bend that. And we could see maybe alliances between the Social Democrats and the Socialists. We could see a coalition or even a support from the Socialists, until we have another election, or at least for a few years. Alternatively, we could see an alliance between the Social Democrats and Chega. They're both right-wing parties. Now, I believe the Social Democrats or the center-right in Portugal ruled out working with Chega in the last election. However, if Chega is able to grow their support and continue to become stronger, it is possible they could change that and decide to end up working with Chega. However, with both of these options, with either going if the center-right chooses to go with the center-left or the right-wing populist Chega, they could either actually form coalitions with them, or they could decide just to run as a minority government with Chega or the socialists supporting them as supplying confidence. So they do have their options, but there is no real clear, stable majority in the country unless unless the Social Democrats decide to actually form a coalition with Chega, which I don't believe is, clear as of now. We will still, of course, have, coalition talks and a lot of debates, and we could see snap elections occur in a year's time. We could see, in a few years, early elections being held, and, these results changing even further. But that's going to be it for Portugal. So I wanted to give an overview of all three of these elections. And then, of course, we will still have the second round of the Polish presidential election. I'll probably do a video in between here and June 1st, looking at some of the polls, seeing what's happened. And that's going to be it for this video. So I hope you all like it. If you do, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you all for watching.